Loudmouth?
Loudmouth.
That's adorable.
Thank you. Like my jacket. Almost as popular as gin.
Yes.
In Australia, that's saying something.
I take your word for it.
Yeah. If we rewound the clock back to when you were growing up in New Jersey, and we said that in 2018 you'd be on stage talking about your life and culture, what would you have thought back then that you would have done with your life? What did you want to do?
It depends when you're talking about. I mean, I wanted to be a writer, and I am.
Yeah.
So I was right.
Did you move to New York expressly with that vision?
I did.
When you were
18.
What was it like?
When it was, I might have been 19, I can never remember. Well, it was like 1970, so it was dangerous. And people who are young now think it was cheap. They said, "You're kidding, that's what an apartment costs?" But it was always the most expensive place to live in the United States. And so it is still the most expensive place to live in the United States. But it is cleaner, and it is duller.
Are those two things causally related?
People think they are, but I know they're not. And people are always saying, "Would you like it better if it was dirty like it used to be and dangerous like it used to be?" I said, no. But no, they're not related. They're absolutely not related. What everybody says about the 70s now is that New York was going bankrupt, which apparently was. I did not know that because I had no money. So, the bankruptcy of a city is of no interest to citizens of the city who are themselves bankrupt. So I really had no idea. I thought it was just me who had no money. The problem with what they did to repair that was that they decided that the way to make New York prosperous was by tourism. And so, like 4 men went into a room with a pencil and a pad. This is exactly what resulted in the Middle East, by the way. So they were different 4 men, but they were 4 men, okay? And truthfully, if they had, switched places, if the 4 men who made up the Middle East had made up like New York's tourism, and the tourist people in New York had gotten the Middle East, same result. And so the thing is, New York is very unpopular in the United States. I mean, Americans hate New York. So the way to draw them to New York was to make a New York that they would like. Hence Times Square. And so they made Times Square, which is where tourists like to go. And if I was in charge of New York, which I wasn't and I am not, I would stand at the border. I would solve 2 problems. The tourism problem in New York, which last year we had 58 million tourists in New York. 58 million. And I only know this because they brag about it. I would stand at the border and I would say, okay, there were 58 million people here who were not citizens, residents of New York. So here's what we're going to do. We can take 58 million refugees. All right, clearly, there's room. 58 million immigrants, and immigrants make the culture, and tourists ruin it. So I would stand at the border, and I would say, "You want to come in? How long are you staying? That's all your luggage? No. Go back." So that would solve all those problems. I also could solve the Middle East, but not now.
Do we want to hear the plan to solve the Middle East?
It's very similar.
You get everyone from the Midwest to go to the Mideast.
That's right. And let the people from the Middle East go to the Midwest, where when people are that bored, they don't fight them.
Omaha would be a very different place, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I'm not sure that there are 58 million hotel rooms at the Four Seasons, but I guess you'd find...
Not everybody stays at the Four Seasons.
Okay.
Okay. So the fact that we accommodate, even before Airbnb, a hideous invention, every time you build a hotel, you're building it in a place where there should be an apartment building. And that is another reason why real estate is so expensive in New York.
One of the themes of this festival and of this event is nostalgia and cultural nostalgia. And I feel like New York, at the time that you moved there, is the kind of place that people feel nostalgic for, even if they've never been to New York, because it's so sort of iconic. Warhol and the music of the 70s and Taxi Driver and all that. Did you have a sense at the time that it was something that was going to foster that kind of sentiment? Did it feel like you were part of something bigger than yourself?
No, I've never felt there was anything bigger than myself, but No, but it is true. In other words, New York in the 70s is something of interest to everyone. I did not think about that. And at first it startled me. In other words, kids frequently come up to me and talk to me, and they say, oh, I wish I lived in New York in the 70s. And, I know that when I was young, I didn't go up to people and say, oh, I wish I lived in New York in the 40s. So that, like, for young people to want to have lived in a previous era is unusual, I think. To have nostalgia for something you didn't live through is almost the same thing as having nostalgia for something you did live through, because both are wrong. But I think it's going to remain that way, the way that, like, Paris in the 20s seems very romantic to people. Why that is, I'm not certain, but it does absolutely seem the case that it's not going to change.
There's a concept in, I think it's Japanese, which is like a sense that you will in the future feel nostalgic about the thing that you're experiencing in the present, which I think is quite nice. Like, you sometimes have those wistful moments if there's a moment of great tenderness or love, or you're on vacation or something, and you're like, wow, in 40 years' time I'm going to look back on this and think this is incredible and wish I was here. Is that an experience that you have?
No.
One day at a time.
No.
I mean, you were on... I was Googling around some of your old videos, and you were on David Letterman 35 years ago, cracking wisecracks, and
He looks better, right, without that beard?
Certainly looked better without the beard, although the gap in the teeth was always there. What did you make of that?
Of Letterman?
Yeah, and of being a young person who had such cultural cachet that they were able to be on Letterman.
I don't know. I didn't think about it. I mean, I liked being on television a lot because it made me feel more American. Especially at that time, and even it's still the case, that, Americans don't really think New York is America, and New Yorkers know it's not. But being on television, it was the most American thing you could do. That TV show was all over the country. And so that it prepared Americans more for me.
In your first book, Metropolitan Life, you wrote the following, quote, very few people possess true artistic ability. It's therefore both unseemly and unproductive to irritate the situation by making an effort. If you have a burning, restless urge to write or paint, simply eat something sweet and the feeling will pass.
See, no one ever listens to me. Sometimes I'm accused of being a bad influence, and I'm shocked because I'm not an influence at all. I'm constantly telling people what to do, they never do it.
This was in 1978. I mean, this was, I feel like if you could fast forward to today, where everybody is curating their lives in real time on Instagram, it would seem prescient.
Yes? What do you mean, would? That's what prescient means.
Has it gotten... Has it gotten worse?
Has what gotten worse?
The sense that everybody thinks that they possess artistic ability and that their lives are worth telling.
Well, of course it's gotten worse because now they have the means to disseminate this. I mean, before that, people weren't able to instantly transmit their, hopes, dreams, and ambitions to everyone else. Now they do. So this used to be, a more confined thing.
Yeah.
Also, it didn't used to be, writing, for instance, didn't used to be a profession in the way that it is now. I mean, for instance, I don't know about here, but in the United States, there are all these writing schools, graduate programs in writing. A, they cost about $60,000 a year. And B, you cannot teach people how to write. So I don't understand. There was one when I was young. There was University of Iowa Writers Workshop. There may have been one or two others, but there are now just dozens and dozens of these things. And so it was not a thing that most people's parents would want them to do, to be a writer. And now they do because that's who pays for these graduate schools. So now it's kind of like being a dentist. People think you can go to school and then you can become a writer. And in a way, they're kind of right. However, it's not true. I have friends who teach in these writing schools because a lot of writers have to teach because it's not like being a dentist. You don't make that much money. And I always say, what do you teach them? And they always say, I teach them how to read. And I think, well, then you should call it, a reading degree. And the reason you can't teach people how to write is because it is a talent. And you cannot teach people how to have a talent. So that talent is probably the most democratic thing there is in the world because it is absolutely randomly scattered among the population. You know, it's not a thing that's genetic, it's not a thing you can buy, it's not a thing you can teach. So, you know, there are many people who go to these writing schools who have careers, but a career is not the same thing as an ability to write.
Do you think it's more legit to want to be a writer now than it was in the 70s?
I don't know what you mean by legit. I mean, it is more of a profession now, and these writing schools do feed into things. They write, they get published, they put a story in the New Yorker, then they get a book contract, and then they review each other's books. And I mean, I did once say to people, who reads? I mean, I buy these books sometimes thinking, I love to read, you know, and I love novels, and I buy these books, and I think, like, who reads these books? And they do.
I mean, the reason... The reason I ask about legit is because what you're saying is sort of runs counter to a criticism that I hear a lot about education these days, which is that it's purely vocational, that everyone's being encouraged to go into STEM, that it's not artistic enough, that the idea of a liberal arts education is dying, and that actually what we need more of is encouraging people to become things like writers.
But it isn't a question of a liberal arts education. It isn't so that you become a writer. It's so that you read books written by writers.
You don't have a mobile phone, is that true?
That is true. I do not have a mobile phone.
Is that a conscious decision?
Well, kind of conscious. I mean, not as conscious as it looks, because people now, you know, of course, accuse me of being a Luddite. That is partially because they don't know what a Luddite was. But I don't have a computer. I don't have an iPhone, I don't have an iPad, I don't have a microwave oven. If you told me that I could text you on my microwave oven, I would believe you. But the reason for this is not an aversion to technology, it's an antipathy toward machinery, period. I never had a typewriter, so I don't know how to type, and you have to type on these things. And when they first invented the sort of computer you would have in your house, it was called a word processor. And a friend of mine got one, a friend of mine who's a screenwriter, and said, this is fantastic, you have to come see this. And I went and I looked at it, and I thought, this is just a very fast typewriter. You know, I don't know how to type, and I don't need anything this fast. I mean, I write so slowly, I could write in my own blood without hurting myself. You know? So, I did not know that the whole world would go into these machines. You know, perhaps if I knew that, I might have made some effort to learn how to do it. But I didn't know that, and as far as having, like, a phone, you know, a cell phone that you walk around with all the time, when they did invent those things, I absolutely did not want one. And, you know, especially because people say, but I can't reach you. I said, that is the point of not having it. And one of the things that I mean, the invention of these things, you know, is, of course, quite surprising. They're quite kind of miraculous. But the thing that surprises me the most is that people mostly, or largely, have given up talking on the phone instead to text. I find this breathtaking. It is so much easier to talk on the phone.
You just said you don't want people calling you, nor do we.
But people text each other, you know. I know you can read them when you want, supposedly, although that can't be true since everyone's always on them. But the idea that people, to me, this seems like technology going backwards. If first they invented texting, then they invented the telephone, people said, it's incredible, you don't have to write, you just pick it up, and you only make your plans once. You know, you don't keep changing them because they can keep finding you. So that even if I suddenly knew how to work things, which I don't, I would never text, because the idea that I would spend my entire life writing for free is out of the question.
I mean, the funny thing about smartphones is you say you don't want people calling you, but actually the vast majority of what people who have smartphones do on their phones is not talking to people. I mean, what proportion would you say of the amount of time that you spend on your smartphone is actually people calling you or you calling other people? Like 10%, 5%, 2%?
Right, but when they first invented cell phones, you could not text on them. They were for talking.
No, I understand.
So,
but I'm just...
now people don't, that's what I just said. They don't like to talk on the phone. They'd rather text on the phone.
Yeah.
You know, I would rather read.
Some people are reading on their phones.
Yeah, not books.
Not books.
I know that you can. You know, I ride the subway, okay? The New York City subway system used to be awash in newsprint. In fact, the streets were. They were ankle deep in newspapers. That's all you saw, newsprint all over the place. Now, everyone has one of these. There's some aspect of this whatever you call it, this transmission that doesn't work on the subway. But some of it does. So I sit on the subway and I look at people, they're all on their phones, and 90% of them, adults, are playing games. Okay? Adults, not little children. Adults playing games on their phone. Do you think this can be a good thing for America? Okay? I mean, I was on a plane next to a guy going from, I think, Dallas to New York or something, and he was a very nice person to sit next to, by which I mean he didn't talk, but he was on his phone, and he was right next to me, and he was an adult, okay? And he had a job, important enough that someone paid for his first class seat, not me, and he was playing a game on his phone, and so afterward I said to someone, they said, well, what was the game? I said, I don't know, it seemed like he was killing fruit. I looked at it,
There are a few of those.
and I thought, this occupied him for like 4 hours. So, I don't think, you think it's a good thing?
No, I mean, this is partly why I was interested in why you don't have a mobile phone, because I thought that there might be some conscious conceit behind it, in the sense that we never have moments in our lives at the moment where we are bored, where we just have to fill time. I mean, I remember when they introduced the ability to use your cell phone on the subway, and it changed everything, because people at least used to have to either read or gaze vacantly into middle distance.
You can't talk
look
on
at
the
people.
subway. You can't get reception on the subway, but you can use it.
No, it's at a lot of stations now you can.
Not on a train. Oh, here?
Yeah.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
I don't live here. I hope this doesn't come to New York. The cell phone companies have offered, this is my favorite thing, we offer New York City for free. We will, do whatever you have to do to enable, and New Yorkers say, no, we don't want this. Because what would make the subways worse? People yelling onto their phone. So, so far we don't have that.
Well, now they're thinking about trialling it on planes. Can you imagine?
No. No. You mean so you could talk on...
Yeah, so you could actually talk on your cell phone on the plane, and it would use an internal system on the plane to
within
broadcast.
2 seconds, there would be, like, a murder on a plane.
I just wonder whether or not it does something to people's sense of creativity so I'm asking this specifically because a friend of mine just recently intentionally got rid of his mobile phone, and we'd made plans. You just said a moment ago, you make plans once and then you don't change them constantly. So I thought to myself, well, what would I do if I were running late? And I thought,
I'm never late.
I would just have to not ever
be late.
What a...
Okay, all right.
This is a revelation.
I am certainly, I'm the most reliable person in New York. Now, admittedly, this is not a rough field. But sometimes I'll be in a restaurant, and someone who works in the restaurant will come over and say, so-and-so just called, they're really sorry, but they're running late. And I said, I already know that. And he said, and the person will say, how? And I say, because they're not here. However, it is not acceptable to do that. I do not accept it. Okay, it's as simple as that. How hard could it be? You have a plan to meet at 9 o'clock, you're there at 9 o'clock. Who are you that you think you could change that plan? All right? This is not connected, but on my way here, from LA to Melbourne, which is where I was going, which, as you know, is a 12,000-hour flight. When we finally got there, I noticed that they don't call it circling anymore, but whatever they call it, I noticed we were circling. I noticed this because I've been looking at my watch for 16 hours, basically thinking, when can I smoke? And then there was an announcement from the pilot saying that we were not going to be landing right away because the air traffic control or something did not sequence the landings properly, and the pilot was very annoyed. Like, usually, one of the things that annoys me about pilots is that they're not annoyed. Is that they say, well, we're very sorry, but just relax. We hope you enjoy. No, land the plane. Okay. And the pilot got on the intercom and said, as if this flight wasn't already long enough. They are not letting us land yet.
Let me guess, you weren't flying Qantas.
No. And I thought to myself, this guy smokes. This guy wants to get off this plane. And then I thought to myself, how is it possible we can't land? It's not like we're just dropping by. We left 20 hours ago. Did they not call and say, in 20 hours, get ready, we're going to be there? So they have all this technology, but it doesn't matter.
You're fairly scathing about conformism in your writing. You write that except in extremely rare instances, people are pretty much like everyone else. They all say the same things, have the same names, and wear their hair in the same styles. Is that any better or worse today than it used to be?
No, it's always the same. It's human nature. Human nature is not that great. That's why they call it human nature and not human heart. No, people feel that they're very different from each other, because it makes people feel, I don't know, I suppose, less despairing, but people are in many ways alike, which is why you can predict the behavior of people very frequently, which is why adults very often know what children are doing. It's not just your own history of having been a child, it's because, even though I know your own child is, of course, very special, most people could say, children will do this, and so will adults. So I know that there are some people who are distinctive, but that's what distinctive means. There aren't not that many of them.
Mm. Has it been part of one of your goals to be one of those people?
I never thought about it. I never really thought about it.
You never thought about being distinctive, Fran?
No, I don't think about other people that much. All right? So, in other words, first you have to compare yourself to other people, all right? Which I don't do that much, okay? So that, I never thought about it in that way. That is true. Mm. I know you don't believe me, but I don't care.
That's the sort of thing that only a distinctive person would say. Some of your writing, one of the loveliest things about your writing is how politically incorrect it can feel. There's a piece in your first book in which you talk about how much you hate dogs, which to begin with is a controversial statement for a lot of people. And then you say that when you say that dogs should be banned from New York, a lot of people say, well, what about people who are lonely without dogs? Or what about blind people? And you say the solution is we should get rid of dogs and make the lonely people lead the blind people around.
It's a perfect solution. And of course, I wrote that probably like 40 years ago or 30 years ago. And of course, it's much worse now because people's attitude towards animals is much more crazy than it was then. A billion times. I would never have predicted it. So that, for instance, there probably were always people that pushed their dogs around in a baby carriage inside their house, but they didn't do it in public because, of course, it's mortifying. There maybe were people who always put coats on their dogs, little garments, but they did it in the privacy of their own home. Because they were ashamed of it. And they were right. And the idea of dogs wearing clothes, what do they think fur is? The dog comes clothed. You don't have to clothe the dog. Please don't. And also, there's so many. People have more dogs than they used to have. And they can go in more places. Dogs can come on planes now.
Well, especially in the States, it's crazy.
Crazy.
The plane is half full of dogs these days.
Yes, and you can bring the dog on the plane if it's something called an emotional support animal, okay? And they have to wear this little vest, and it says ESA on it. And adults, here's what they're doing. They're saying, I am something so wrong with me that I cannot get on a plane without my dog. So, since it's very clear what this is, why bother with a live dog? Children have teddy bears. That's what that is, okay? I personally would provide a teddy bear to every person in the United States who wants to bring a dog on a plane I'm on. Leave the dog home, here's your teddy bear.
And you know how you get those little vests that say emotional support animal? You go to a website and you pay $14.99 and they send them to you. It's honestly, there's no more than that. You just have to get it and then you dress your dog up in the stupid little outfit and you can bring them on a plane.
It's a really shocking idea, I have to tell you. And the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, who some people, but not me, think should be president, he made a law that you can bring a dog into a restaurant that has an outside part of the restaurant, like an outside cafe. The dog can sit in that outside cafe. Isn't that disgusting?
Just watching you eat.
No, that I have to watch a dog while I'm eating.
Yeah.
I think that's disgusting.
Why shouldn't the governor of New York be president?
Well, I'm not saying in general the governor of New York should not be the president. This one should not be the president because he's a thug. Okay? I know he's a Democrat, and yes, he would be better than Donald Trump, but that can't be the standard. Okay? So, I mean, his father was the governor of New York, and I am constitutionally opposed to dynasties. You know, so that is why we had that little war with England.
In terms of political correctness, do you have any sense that that people are easier to upset now than they used to be? Not being on social media, it's possible that you don't have to experience that firsthand. But Twitter is just a vast cluster F of people getting angry about the most irrelevant things. And I wonder whether or not social media has sort of facilitated that in a way that makes it, I don't know, people less likely to say controversial stuff.
Well, as you said, I'm not on it, but I'm aware of it. I hear about it. Yes, people are overly sensitive, there's no question, but also people cherish these things in themselves. In other words, their ability to be easily offended is something they quite cherish because they believe, you know, that it's a kind of morality, you know, but it is not. Okay, emotion is not morality. You know, morality is you have to do something, okay? And just being offended is insufficient. Yes, it's better than Donald Trump, but it's not enough. Okay, so I know also in colleges in the United States they stop people from coming to speak if they don't agree with them, and the idea that that's a left position is shocking to me. You know, yes, of course, I would prefer not to hear a Nazi speak. So if I was in college and a Nazi came to speak at my college, I wouldn't go, but I would know how important it is. It is incredibly important to let him speak, especially the more you would hear someone like that speak, the less powerful they would be. Because you know, these people, you know, are idiots. You know, I mean, if you actually hear this stuff, and especially the people who believe in it, if they really listen to it, perhaps they would not believe in it.
Mm. And sometimes it's not even Nazis. Sometimes it's just people who are using the fact that they know that they're going to get a rise out of people for publicity. Milo Yiannopoulos and these kinds of people who go around to campuses, say provocative things, know that people are going to riot, and that's what gets them the very notoriety that gets them the invitation to the next campus.
Yes, well, that's someone who wants to be too distinctive, don't you think?
Yeah, yes. Does that have any relevance to the movement that we're in regarding sexual harassment? I know that you know a lot of the big fish, the men who have been brought down by this, swimming in the cultural circles that you do, and we're reaching a sort of point at which I feel there's a potential for a mild backlash, and I wonder...
This is a wish of men. Okay?
It's not my wish.
Yes, this is, well, everyone who brings this up to me is a man. So, this is a wish.
Jermaine Greer's not a man.
I'm sorry?
Jermaine Greer's not a man. Catherine Deneuve's not a man.
Catherine Deneuve is French. I didn't know Jermaine Greer said this, but I believe that she did. Do I think there's going to be a backlash? I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Do I think that, you know, men would prefer this wasn't happening? Yes, I do. I do think that they would prefer this wasn't happening. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. When people say, like, well, there's a difference between this, and, you know, I suppose that is true to some extent. There is already a backlash, just the fact that these men said this, and also Jermaine Greer. But if you're asking me if I think that's a legitimate position, no, I do not. And I also think that this is not the kind of thing that you can explain to a man. You cannot. You know, you just can't explain it because it's not a thing. It's not just these incidents, these episodes, these things that happen to people. This thing happened to this woman because this man did this. It is the very world you live in from the time you're like 13, if you're a girl. So that you cannot describe this to a man. Okay? Now, I mean, do I think that's going to change? You know, somewhat. You know, but it's going to change in these kind of segmented ways. Like, you can maybe get this job you couldn't get before. A man can't act this way on the job. But the world is not going to change completely because it's biological. You know, I mean, it's not like people say things like, do you think there'll ever be, feminism will really be successful? Not if you mean total equality, I don't. Do I think it should be? Of course, I would love it to be. Do I think it's going to end? I do not. The way that, for instance, racism could end. It's not going to, because of human nature. But racism could end because it's a total fantasy. Racism is just a fantasy of superiority. There literally is no difference between people of different races. Zero difference. It's like saying, we are different species because your jacket is plaid and mine is striped. It's meaningless. But there are real differences between men and women. So if you tell me, oh, well, but what about the time where men will get pregnant by accident? Then it'll be equal. But before that happens, it will not. So, to me, as good as it can become, that's how I would like it to become, And as far as these guys who got caught, I was flabbergasted. It never occurred to me that would stop, ever. Ever. I mean, it was one of the most surprising things of my life. And then to see one after another, it was so enjoyable. You have no idea. So at the very least, those particular guys, they're finished. I know they don't think that. I'm sure many of them, are plotting.
I think Harvey's got an idea.
I doubt it. But, I think that, a lot of them think they're going to get back in some way. Those particular people, I don't think will. It's not that I think there'll be a lesson to anyone, but I think it's just good to get these particular people out. Additionally, especially at the height of this, when there was like one every 3 days, there are all these fantastic jobs open. These are some of the best jobs in the country. If you actually gave all these jobs to women, this would stop. You'd have some bad bosses. Women can be bad bosses, but you don't have this. This is particularly butch.
I didn't want to ask you about the orange genius in the White House at the moment because I have a sneaking suspicion that during the Q&A, which we're going to get to in just a moment, someone maybe might ask a question about Trump, just potentially. But just broadly about whether or not you're optimistic and pessimistic about the moment that we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a weird moment politically with Trump and with Brexit in the UK and with the rise of right-wing populist parties here and in Western Europe. And yet at the same time, there are all kinds of cultural movements that should give us heart, like the one you were just talking about. Where do you think we're at?
Well, I would rather it was the other way around. In other words, I would rather that these movements we're talking about were people who are actually in power. The reason you have to have a movement is because you're out of power. So, the reason you have to have a protest movement is you're protesting people who are in power. So if you would ask me, I would rather that I was the president and Donald Trump was sitting here telling you what he thinks. Okay? So, but that's not going to happen. I think it's more than a weird moment to have Donald Trump be the president. And I also think, although these things aren't connected, I agree with you. Brexit, these right-wing movements in Eastern Europe, they are connected, but none of them are as bad as Donald Trump being the president. None, because they're more regional, they're more containable. When Trump was elected, a friend of mine who was Italian said, well, it'll be all right, we had Berlusconi. And I said, yes, and that was terrible for the Italians. I'm sorry. But the president of the United States affects the whole world. So it's horrible for the whole world. You don't have to think about it as much as we do, because we think about him 24 hours a day. And that has never happened. There have been a lot of presidents that are horrible in my lifetime, and we had 8 years of George Bush. I never thought it could be worse than that. But we didn't think about George Bush 24 hours a day. So that in societies where people think about the leader or the president 24 hours a day, those are dictatorships. That's where there's like the big man, and you have to think about him. In North Korea, they think about Kim Jong-il, whatever his name is, they think about him 24 hours a day, okay? And so I never expected that to be happening, in the West Village. And now it does. So that, another thing about planes and devices, you're on a plane, people aren't getting that stuff because you can't get that stuff on a plane, I guess. And then you get off the plane, and the guy who's standing behind you turns on his phone and goes, oh my God. And then the guy sitting next to you goes, what do you do now? And this is what brings us together.
I did hear someone say that a decent definition of freedom is not having to think is realizing that a week has gone by without thinking about your leader.
That's right. That's exactly what I meant.
Yeah,
and that doesn't happen anymore.
And that doesn't happen here either, as well. I mean, just in terms of Trump, the amount of kind of emotional and intellectual bandwidth that's getting sucked up by that guy is sometimes it makes me wonder whether or not we're partly at fault for this as well.
We're not.
We're not.
Wait, this is one of the simplest things. We know whose fault this is. His. Okay? I mean, it's very, like, I am a fault finder. I am telling you, I have found the fault. It's him. It is not me. It is not you. Neither of us voted for him. Okay? We know who it was. It's the people who voted for him. They are at fault. It's the Russians. They are at fault. It's James Comey. He is at fault. We have an actual list of the people we know who they are. We have their names.
Couldn't the media tell us a nice story about some far-off galaxy where some stars are doing something funky once in a while instead of always reporting on the bad stuff, though?
Well, it's partially, I wouldn't say the fault of the media, but the amount of coverage they gave him, which he chortled about. I got $1 billion worth of free, coverage, because the ratings went up. Because people, it's like watching a car crash. People look, people were riveted by this. I mean, it's like what Les Moonves said, who's the chairman of CBS. He said it may be bad for America, but it's great for CBS. As if it's so interesting to me that Les thought these are two separate things. So that yes, it's like a great television. I would much rather, of course, have like a sane, intelligent, dull president. He's too exciting.
Who would your pick be?
I'm sorry?
Who would your pick for
Anyone.
a dull president be?
Anyone. I'm telling you, I take the subway, I sit in the subway. If I'm not getting off, I say to myself, when the doors open, the next person who gets on this train would be a better president than Donald Trump. And that is true, even if that person's in a stroller.